Great. Thanks, Elio. Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Sandy Chen. Apologies for the quick vanishing, but I'm back now. I'm the general manager at the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center. And this evening, we are so honored to be able to engage in discussion with you about our newest exhibit, Maru Immigration Stories. Maru Immigration Stories is an exhibit that explores the Japanese diaspora in the Americas from the late 1800s to the present. We look at why they left, where they went, and how they flourished and built communities around the world. Communities which we refer to as Nikkei communities. Nikkei meaning of Japanese origin. We have an online exhibit on the Google Arts and Culture platform, which I hope some of you have had a chance to look at. And we also have a physical exhibit at the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center here in Toronto. These two exhibits are similar and different, and they complement each other really nicely in exploring the story of the Nikkei people. So our exhibit covers the regions of Hawaii, USA, Canada, Brazil, and Peru. And we are committed to building on this exhibit to include stories of Nikkei communities from other parts of the world too. Tonight, we would like to look at some of these themes and stories in this exhibit together, and how photography plays an important role in building our narrative, in inspiring discussion, and in providing visual impact for our audience. But before we dive into the exhibit, I just want to take a moment to talk about our organization. The Japanese Canadian Cultural Center in Toronto, or the JCCC, was established in 1963, almost 60 years ago. On one hand, we are a cultural center with rich programming to promote Japanese and Japanese Canadian culture. But central to our mission is also our commitment to the ongoing preservation and enriching of the history of the Japanese Canadian community, which dates back to the late 1800s. We have a robust research and education arm at the JCCC, which we call our Heritage Department. Tonight, you will hear from two of my colleagues, Su Yen Chong, who is the Heritage Manager for Research and Exhibition, as well as Theressa Takasaki, our Heritage Manager for Archive, Collections, and Programming. And they will talk to the importance of the role of photography in documenting our community's history, both in studying the past, as well as in enriching our communal memories of the present. And in our virtual exhibit, we worked closely with Google's Arts and Culture platform. And I'd like to share a quick video greeting from one of their staff, Anna Schultz, with you all. Thanks, Ian.
My name is Anna Schultz, and I assisted the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center team with preparing their Google Arts and Culture profile. I was born and live in Poland, which is another country from where many people emigrated to different parts of the world. And it was very interesting for me to learn about similar experiences in other nations' history. I think it's very important for all of us to have in mind that an experience of leaving one's country in origin in search for a better life is not associated to any group in particular, and it may happen to any nation, to any ethnic group. And those exhibits, in fact, tell a very universal story. And I recommend them not only to people for whom this is part of their family story, for instance, not only to people of Japanese origin living now in Canada.
Thanks, Ian. Next slide, please. Our exhibit is called Maru. Maru is the term used for ships in Japan. All the names of the ship would end with a Maru. In this photograph, you can see Kasato Maru. Kasato Maru was the ship which made one of the longest journey at its time in the early 1900s, and it carried passengers from Japan all the way to Sao Paulo, Brazil, a journey that lasted for 52 days. And another ocean liner called the Hikawa Maru helped bring many of our pioneers over from Japan to Vancouver and Seattle in the 1930s. For those of us who are in the Toronto area, you'll be able to see a model of the Hikawa Maru in our physical exhibit. The details of this model and the accompanying photographs that we have will show you why she was often referred to as the Queen of the Pacific. And so Maru and the concept of journey is central to this exhibit. In the Japanese language, Maru also means circle. The growth and development of Nikkei communities around the world has allowed this exhibit to showcase a range of unique stories. But what we find is that in these stories, defined by specific people, in specific times, and at specific places, they're all tied together by common fundamental themes. Themes such as ambition, or family, or survival. And that is the second central idea that Maru depicts, that the Nikkei diaspora is a human story embodied in the circle of life. That no matter when or where these stories happened, its timeless and universal themes are just as relevant today as it was 50 or 100 years ago. One of the themes that's central to the study of any diasporic community is the integration and diversifying of cultures. In Canada, diversity has become a very familiar concept. And within the global Nikkei community, we are also seeing greater recognition of mixed cultures. And one story I would like to highlight from our exhibit is a spotlight on an unassuming little town in Japan called Oizumi. And this little town is filled with surprises. It is known as the Brazil town of Japan. And in this photograph, you can see the juxtaposition straight away. Within the context of a local Japanese neighborhood, with the architecture in the background and the banners written in Japanese, we see people dressed in samba costumes, a typical Brazilian carnival wear. But what is most noteworthy is that it shows us that these people are celebrating. They are celebrating their multi-layered identity within this unique context. And it is our hope that images such as this one, as well as a range of medium that we use in our exhibits, will work together to tell a compelling human story where visitors can experience and relate to through a variety of senses and interactions. And with that, I now invite our colleague Theressa Takasaki to talk about her role in this exhibit, as well as the preservation work she does here at the JCCC. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. Good evening. I am Theressa, the Heritage Manager of Archive Collections and Programming at the JCCC. Thank you for joining us this evening. We are always excited to be able to share what we do in the JCCC Heritage Department with people who are as passionate about historic photographs as we are. As many of you will know, we are approaching the 200th anniversary of the oldest known photograph, at least according to Google, taken by, and please excuse my pronunciation, Joseph Nicephore Niepce in 1826 or 1827 using the hierography technique. Since then, we've been looking for ways to enhance, display, and safeguard the photographs that we have taken so that they can be shown off to others in some form or another. Initially, photographs were developed, framed, and displayed as a sign of wealth and prestige. Next slide, please. With the advent of personal cameras, such as the Kodak Brownie camera, photography and casual photographs took off. This created a need for different ways to display and store photos. The first recorded use of the word scrapbook is also from the 1820s, with the intent of scrapbooks being to store personal mementos. Their use quickly expanded to include photographs. This practice took off in the early 1900s, with people creating scrapbooks that told stories of their lives. These books often included handwritten notes about the people, places, and events that they were describing, and are often passed down through families, and when necessary, onto institutions such as ours. Next slide, please. At the JCCC, the Heritage Department is most interested in collecting and preserving photographs, artifacts, and archival records related to the migration of Japanese settlers to Canada, their forced removal from the BC coast and internment during World War II, and their resettlement throughout Canada in the years after World War II. These photographs, especially those from within the internment camps of World War II, are integral to preserving the community memory and history of a very difficult time. We have been collecting photographs, artifacts, and archival collections since the opening of the JCCC in 1963. The collections are used for exhibits, education, and family research. As all of the photographs within the collections of the JCCC are donated, they are primarily related to individual families and/or communities. Next slide, please. These albums, like the Grand Forks Farmers Association album and the photographs they contain, help to tell the story of Japanese Canadians, from the first registered settler in 1877 to the settlement years on the coast of British Columbia, to the internment years and the camps and communities that housed them, to the resettlement years east of the Rocky Mountains. One of the main objectives of the Heritage Department is to continuously work on digitizing the photos in our collections. Through the financial assistance of programs like the Documentary Heritage Communities Program, Young Canada Works, and Canada Summer Jobs, the JCCC has been teaching and mentoring interns on how to properly digitize photos for preservation purposes. These photos are then stored digitally in both a secure server on-site and off-site storage to ensure access to them for years to come. Next slide, please. This digitization process involves scanning at a relatively high DPI for preservation purposes, then uploading compressed versions of the photos to our shared public database, nikkeimuseum.org. As many of the photographs in our collection do not exist in any other collections in the country, we have partnered with 3 museums on the West Coast to provide a good overview of the photographs and artifacts that exist. This partnership allows researchers and families a one-stop shop to find items relating to Japanese Canadian history. Next slide, please. All of the photos within the JCCC collections are precious to us. In addition to scanning preservation copies of the original photographs, we are also committed to storing our photos in the best way we can. Using archival quality photos, acid-free tissues, soft lead pencils, and a lot of care, we are working to rehouse photos where necessary and to store them and the albums they come in a manner that will maintain their current state for many decades to come. With the help of our dedicated volunteers, many of whom are survivors of the internment of Japanese Canadians, we are working to catalog and identify all of the photographs within our collection, focusing on the people, places, and events that they portray. It is especially important to us at the JCCC that the photographs which are housed within our collection are available to the community for either personal use or for viewing through exhibitions like Maru Immigration Stories. While we were initially working through ideas and plans for Maru, we logged dozens of photographs from within the JCCC collection and collections throughout the world for inclusion in the exhibit. Over time, we narrowed it down to the photos that you have seen in the virtual exhibit and the ones that appear on the panels in our Moriyama Nikkei Heritage Center. We further enhanced the exhibit by using select images to convey the stories that we were telling through our display cases, using them as backdrops to artifacts like the general store photos that are in the virtual exhibit. By combining these digitized photos with artifacts, we are able to tell a more layered story, which will attract the attention of many visitors, we hope. I will now turn you over to Su Yen, who will tell you more about specific photographs within the exhibit and why they were chosen as part of our final list. Thank you very much. Su Yen?
Thank you, Theresa. Hi, everyone. I'm Su Yen, and I'm one of the team members behind Maru Immigration Stories. Some of you may have already gone through the virtual exhibit already, and I hope what you saw have encouraged you to visit the entirety of Maru Immigration Stories at the JCCC in late September when we are reopening our doors for tour appointments. Before I jump into our discussion, I would like to quickly summarize the background info and timeline of Nikkei communities in the Americas in the way that this exhibit has framed them. Japan transitioned from military to imperial rule in 1868. The new Meiji government's drive for industrialization forced hundreds and thousands of farmers out of work. Emigration was seen as a quick solution, and thus, over the next few decades, Japanese immigrants would migrate to the Americas. Usually hailing from the poorest provinces, migrant workers face similar poor living conditions, severe workload, and regular abuse across the Americas. In this photograph, for example, you have the plantation manager on a horse behind workers from various countries who migrated to Hawaii as low-cost laborers in sugar plantation. Within decades, Japanese immigrants across the Americas progressed from working in labor-intensive jobs and transitioning into work in the service industry. In this example, we have first-generation Japanese-American employee in a hotel kitchen in Hood River, Oregon, taken in 1914. And eventually, they moved on to owning small businesses themselves. On the left is a photograph of Dr. Munagi Yoshitaka Dental's office in Ogden, Utah, taken in 1924. And on the right is a photograph of a Japanese store in Colonial Hirano in Sao Paulo State, Brazil, that is situated about 550 kilometers from the city of Sao Paulo. The bombing of Pearl Harbor proves to be disastrous for most Nikkei individuals and communities across the Americas. As a direct response, 120,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated. In Canada, 22,000 Japanese Canadians were interned. And we do not have a definite number, but in Peru, the estimate is that at least 2,000 to 3,000 Japanese Peruvians were deported to internment camps in the United States. In this photograph, we see Japanese American families leaving their home in Bainbridge Island, Washington. In the decades after the end of World War II, Nikkei communities across the continent worked to rebuild their lives. Today, we see communities that are flourishing. For example, the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center in Toronto, being really close to 60 years since its inception. On the right is the Clinica Centenario that was built by the Nikkei community in Lima, Peru. On the left is the Colonial Hirano community getting together to celebrate their founder, Unpei Hirano, in the 1970s. The international Japanese diaspora that we're focusing on today is part of a global network of communities, more commonly known as the Nikkei community. They are a combination of many things that create a sense of belonging, and Maru Immigration Stories is an exhibit that explores various connections of the community. Now that we have a rough understanding of the timeline, I would like to talk about our process of picking photographs that helped us hone on a few major themes that guided the exhibition narrative, specifically communal identity and memories. The first example to start this discussion is this photograph that is found in part 1 of the virtual exhibit. It shows a group of women from the 1920s. They were plantation workers in the Waipahu plantation in Hawaii, and on this very day, they were on their way to downtown Honolulu to participate in the 1920 Oahu sugar strike. This photograph is one of the most striking photographs in the exhibit. And I found myself asking why most of their heads were turned away, and then remembering that their livelihood and well-being were at stake here. I remember reading that local women in the city watching the march were brought to tears because they felt so sorry for the workers. And now I would like to bring attention to the work jackets worn by the women here, shown on the right in black and white, but for the most part, they were blue and white patterns called kasuri. Kasuri is a traditional technique used to dye patterns into threads before weaving. Here's an example on the left from the Japanese American National Museum. First generation Japanese Hawaiian women working in plantations wore kasuri work jackets, and they have become visual icons of the community in that era. And this recognition is made possible through the preservation of kasuri work jackets in museums like the Japanese American National Museum, as well as the Japanese Hawaiian Cultural Center. In my previous research on textiles, I learned that museum textile collection, especially in Western countries, are dependent on donors' treatment of textiles. And they often make mistakes as they continue to treat textiles as if they're two-dimensional paintings, and so displaying textiles as such. And unless there's a continuity in tradition in wearing certain style of clothing, we find ourselves indebted to photographs to better understand how, who, and when clothing like the kasuri work jackets were worn. And patterns on these work jackets can be indicative of the region of Japan where the immigrants come from over time. The cuts and styles of the work jackets would continue to evolve as they interacted with other immigrant groups from Philippines and China, for example. They would adapt their kasuri work jackets based on individual preference, and also quite important for practicality as well, since they were working incredibly long hours on the sugarcane plantations. Clothing like the kasuri work jackets were both social markers and expressions of identity. In some ways, these choices were giving immigrant workers agency in a period and place where their voices were often muted by their male counterparts or the more powerful plantation managers and owners. I would venture to say that the act of creating and wearing these kasuri work jackets shows an ongoing process of the Japanese diaspora participation in negotiating their transnational identity. And beside the work jackets, another way our exhibit team was able to understand the lives of these women better are through folk songs known as hole hole bushi. Hole hole is Hawaiian for the dead or dying leaves of the sugarcane. And these songs were sung while they were working. Now I will play a hole hole bushi song sung by Haruo Kasahara, a first generation plantation worker in Hawaii. This song is not available in our virtual exhibit, but it is available in the museum, where visitors will listen to the songs as they go through the section for Japanese Hawaiian.
Nihon 出るときゃよ一人で出たが今じゃ子もある孫もある日本出るときゃよ一人で出たが今じゃ子もある孫もある あそのわきゃちゃっちゃんでぬいぬいまいたい花嫁ごりょうでよ呼び寄せられて指折れ数えて50年あそのわけはちゃっちゃんでぬいぬいあかまえなかまあいなかには勝ちけんよわひには葉っぱえこふふそろってともかせにそのわけはちゃっちゃんでぬいぬいはなはな明日は三里茶よわひにも連れてあいかね訪問と出かけようかそのわけはちゃっちゃんでぬいぬいほろほろかなかの言葉入っとるんですよ。
And the next point that I would like to discuss is applicable to Japanese Canadians and Japanese Americans to some degree. This photograph of Tashmi internment camp in British Columbia was photographed during World War II, and it was chosen as the featured photograph for part 2 of the virtual exhibit. Part 2 discusses the rampant anti-Asian riots in the west coast of the United States and Canada, and then subsequently the incarceration of the Nikkei communities after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. While we could have chosen a shocking image with racial slurs, we thought that this photograph of Tashmi row of house shacks is able to visually express the stripping down of individual and communal identities committed by their respective governments. Our homes and the way we decorate is part and parcel of material culture signaling identities. Even in boxed apartment complexes, there's always some visual cues, maybe through the balcony or an ornament on the door. But in here, none of that can be seen. And to me, that is what makes the photograph so grim and impactful. And when we were doing our research on Japanese American incarceration, we found it challenging to find a lot of photographs of concentration camps, even though the incarceration were committed at a very large scale. In Canada, cameras were prohibited, but these rules were usually not strictly enforced. So you have the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center in Toronto and the Nikkei National Museum in Burnaby, with its incredibly rich collection of photographs taken by internees in the internment camps. In the United States, however, cameras were strictly prohibited. There were instances of homemade cameras by some Japanese Americans, but those were incredibly rare. Instead, the US government would hire photographers like Dorothea Lange. And usually, I won't go into the works of Dorothea Lange, who was commissioned to photograph the incarcerations of Japanese Americans. But I'm in really good luck tonight with this crowd of historical photography lovers and experts. And I really look forward to hearing your thoughts during our Q&A and perhaps offer my team another angle when looking at photographs. Dorothea Lange, following her significant work of documenting migrant families during the Great Depression, she passed on an opportunity to do a year-long fellowship at the Guggenheim in order to photograph the incarceration of Japanese Americans in 1942. However, photographers like Lange had to abide by government rules and guidelines. And so we don't see photographs of barbed wires or anything close to a suggestion that the Japanese Americans were being persecuted. And photographs that would hint at incarceration would be censored, just like this photograph on the right. Keeping in mind that the rest of the approved photographs were not meant for public consumption either. If you're interested in the photographs taken by Dorothea Lange that was censored, I highly recommend checking out this publication, Impounded, that published 119 images that was originally censored by the US Army. What I'd like to drive home today is that in photographs such as this, also taken by Lange, they truly showcase how government has systematically stripped the individuals of not just their rights, but their identity as well. In this photograph on the left, Saku Taro Aso was made to wear these tags with his assigned number. And this treatment was uniform to 120,000 Japanese Americans during World War II. To add salt to injury, they weren't even given the opportunity to self-document this experience during this period of upheaval for future generations by means of photography. On the left is a really cool project by artist Wendy Maruyama. It's Tech Project, a sculptural installation that commemorates 120,000 Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during World War II by displaying their, quote, evacuation tags, end quote, which were used during the war. Back to Canada. When I first started working at the JCCC, one comment that surprised me when talking to second-generation Japanese Canadian regarding their experience during internment is that their experience, for a lack of better word, was, quote, wasn't so bad, end quote. And as mentioned, unlike the Japanese American internment, Japanese Canadians were able to order cameras from Eaton catalogs during the war. Despite cameras being banned, after being removed the remote regions of BC, Japanese Canadians who were only allowed one suitcase per person had the option to order what they needed from the Eaton's catalog. And so many Japanese Canadians ordered cameras. When I was going through hundreds of photographs dated to World War II that I would consider a bleak period for the Japanese Canadian community, I was reminded of Weiji life-saving photograph. This photograph by Weiji is odd, but not entirely, given the cultural phenomenon and accessibility of cameras of the time. It is odd because the scene is obviously an emergency with someone being resuscitated. But the woman being photographed gave a beaming smile. Not that she does not care about the situation, more so that she was conditioned so that when there's a camera flash, she would smile. And I'm sure some or most of you can relate to that feeling somewhat. And I do wonder that in these photographs of Japanese Canadian interned in the mountainous regions of British Columbia, where without context, one might mistake them for holiday albums. Is it the camera effect seen in Weiji photograph? Or as the second generation Japanese Canadian have described, that being sheltered from the harsh truth of their internment by their parents, their experience felt like a very long summer camp, especially in the beginning when there were no schools, just children getting to explore the incredible beauty of British Columbia. I can only speculate, but I suspect they're a little bit of both. The first generation Japanese Canadian parents, knowing full well the implication of their situation, likely masked the gravity of their internment from their second generation children. And again, I would love to hear your thoughts on this, as it is an ongoing conversation for the Nikkei community. Here's another photograph that captures a defining moment for Canada when discussing Japanese Canadian history. At the end of World War II, when Japan surrendered, the British Columbia government barred Japanese Canadians from returning to the west coast of Canada. And under immense pressure, over 4,000 Japanese Canadians with little to no property reluctantly agreed to move to war-torn Japan, while 16,000 Japanese Canadians chose to remain in Canada, moving to east of the Rockies, a place that most of them have never been. And in this photograph, family and friends are saying goodbye when they're leaving the internment camp. One can only imagine the turmoil when families had to make the impossible call as to where they would go next, not knowing what would await them, especially after being interned during the war. On the left is a letter included in the virtual exhibit that expressed the sentiment that most family probably felt. The author, Mary, who was not a minor, was able to stay in Canada when the rest of the family moved to post-war Japan. She wrote to a friend, "It really made me sad, and as I read it, it brought tears to my eyes. I hope that everything will turn out for the best. If mother and father have to go back, it means Helen will have to go back, and I cannot imagine Helen going back to a country she's never seen and a country that's not hers." And to this day, we are not able to identify Mary or Helen, who, like many Japanese Canadian families, were separated. But the story of the Nikkei diaspora doesn't stop at the end of World War II. In our new permanent exhibit on site at the JCCC, the design of our panels was inspired by kintsugi, a Japanese art of putting together broken pottery pieces back with gold, because the Nikkei communities after the war worked to rebuild their community locally. And this eventually bring rise to contemporary identification of being Nikkei. Today, millions of people of Japanese ancestry live in different countries around the world. After being disconnected from each other for decades, they now commonly identify as Nikkei. And while we can see that the building of communal identity, nationalism, and patriotism is not straightforward for the Japanese diaspora, this rebirth of discovering a common history, culture, and memories transcends borders. And it's an incredibly exciting period that coincides with the current climate of globalization. And for Maru, we focus on stories that express Nikkei identities in its locality, and those work as building blocks to discuss transnational Japanese diaspora identity. And it is our team's hope that through Maru immigration stories, we're able to participate in the ongoing conversation of Nikkei communities and its various representation of identities. Thank you.
That was fantastic. My goodness. Thank you. Thank you very much for such an amazing presentation. I would like to stop the recording in just a moment and give us a 5-minute break, bio break. And when we return, we're going to have a question and answer period with our guests from the Japanese Culture Center. Okay? All right. See you in a moment.